Greetings again, non-Western art appreciation class. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Today you can see I'm at the Great Pyramids of Giza because today we'll be talking about African death and particularly ancestral worship and what that means. To get us kicked off today, I want to show you this interesting video on the most interesting funerals in the world.
Names, and there's our 10 bizarre funeral rituals in the world. If you have enjoyed watching this video, please consider.
So remember from our last class where we had actually an introduction to Africa, one of the things we talked about to understand Africa was the idea of death and ancestral spirits that show up. And so we're going to be looking at a number of different traditions today. Now, one of the most important things that shows up, and I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller. One of the most important things is that why are we so fascinated with death and the afterlife? Why do almost all humans fear death? And so this is a concept, no matter where we go around the planet, we have to deal with. Why are humans fascinated with death and the afterlife? And most people philosophically come up with 4 different answers. 1, we just fear the process of dying, right? It is the end all be all. No one's ever come back to show us really what the afterlife is like, unless you believe in a different religious organization, such as Jesus being reborn 3 days afterward for heaven. You actually read the religious scriptures in the Quran or the Torah about what the afterlife is. You believe in reincarnation, but we really don't have people that actually have come back to be able to illustrate what's going on. So there's the fear of the process of dying. Most religions practice that there needs to be some punishment, fear of punishment. That, even if you lived a wonderful life, you did, you did some bad things during your life where you're probably not nice to one individual or another, and so you deserve to be punished for those actions before you head on. There's just the absolute fear of the unknown. What's out there? I mean, we make science fiction films and horror films about this idea of not knowing anything. And finally, the fear of annihilation, the idea that, is this it? When you die, your body basically becomes just matter. And is that the only thing that matters? That you basically are going to become worm food in some capacity, or be eaten like the sky vulture ceremony from Tibet. Now, the Egyptians are that first civilization that believes in something after our death and what develops that has a positive end. All earlier civilizations before the Egyptians came up literally believed that there was nothingness, or more likely there was an afterlife, but the afterlife was not very pleasant, even for those people who were good. And the Egyptians changed this really 4,000 years ago. So as we talked about last time, this is what we're looking at with the Egyptian death and the afterlife. So first off, 70% plus of humans believe in the concepts we're about to go over. And the 3 that are the most important are these 3 right here, as you see up above. The first one, at death, you become an ancestral spirit. Your spirit, your soul force, however you want to phrase it, it kind of goes on. The Egyptians built great monuments to actually preserve the ancestral spirits of the people that are most powerful within their society. Secondly, your ancestral spirit, depending on how good you lived in life, is 10 to 100 times more powerful than your actual life. You become a superhuman. So let's say one of your favorite things to do in life is play basketball like myself. That means in heaven, I could play basketball potentially against Michael Jordan and against LeBron James. Let's say I lived a more moral life. Is Michael Jordan 10 times better than me at basketball? Yes. Is he 20 times better than me at basketball? Yes. Is he 100 times better? No. So if Michael Jordan only got 1% reincarnation or 10%, and I got 100%, we might be competitive and slam dunking on each other for all of eternity. That's a cool concept. Thirdly, the ancestral spirits act as a go-between between your family and the gods. And so I literally could go back and help my family, my friends, by using my extra power to help my family out. And so early on, these are the most important things in Egyptian culture. These Ka statues and the Book of the Dead. It's not the pyramids behind me. Those are storage units, large-scale storage units, actually designed to hold these 2 images that show up. So here's an example of what an Egyptian Book of the Dead shows. Remember, this is all a new religious
Ani
concept.
stands before a large golden scale, where the jackal-headed god Anubis is weighing his heart against a pure ostrich feather. Ani was a real person, a scribe from the Egyptian city of Thebes, who lived in the 13th century BCE. And depicted here is a scene from his Book of the Dead, a 78-foot papyrus scroll designed to help him attain immortality. Such funerary texts were originally written only for pharaohs, but with time, the Egyptians came to believe regular people could also reach the afterlife if they succeeded in the passage. Ani's epic journey begins with his death. His body is mummified by a team of priests who remove every organ except the heart, the seat of emotion, memory, and intelligence. It's then stuffed with a salt called natron and wrapped in resin-soaked linen. In addition, the wrappings are woven with charms for protection and topped with a heart scarab amulet that will prove important later on. The goal of the 2-month process is to preserve Ani's body as an ideal form with which his spirit can eventually reunite. But first, that spirit must pass through the Duat, or underworld. This is a realm of vast caverns, lakes of fire, and magical gates, all guarded by fearsome beasts. Snakes, crocodiles, and half-human monstrosities with names like He Who Dances in Blood. To make things worse, Apep, the serpent god of destruction, lurks in the shadows, waiting to swallow Ani's soul. Fortunately, Ani is prepared with the magic contained within his Book of the Dead. Like other Egyptians who could afford it, Ani customized his scroll to include the particular spells, prayers, and codes he thought his spirit might need. Equipped with this arsenal, our hero traverses the obstacles, repels the monster's attacks, and stealthily avoids Apep to reach the hall of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. Here, Ani faces his final challenge. He is judged by 42 assessor gods, who must be convinced that he has lived a righteous life. Ani approaches each one, addressing them by name and declaring a sin he has not committed. Among these negative confessions, or declarations of innocence, he proclaims that he has not made anyone cry, is not an eavesdropper, and has not polluted the water. But did Ani really live such a perfect life? Not quite, but that's where the heart scarab amulet comes in. It's inscribed with the words, "Do not stand as a witness against me," precisely so Ani's heart doesn't betray him by recalling the time he listened to his neighbor's fight or washed his feet in the Nile. Now it's Ani's moment of truth, the weighing of the heart. If his heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by Ani's wrongdoings, it'll be devoured by the monstrous Amet, part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus, and Ani will cease to exist forever. But Ani is in luck. His heart is judged pure. Ra, the sun god, takes him to Osiris, god of the underworld, who gives him final approval to enter the afterlife. In the endless and lush field of reeds, Ani meets his deceased parents. Here there is no sadness, pain, or anger, but there is work to be done. Like everyone else, Ani must cultivate a plot of land, which he does with the help of a Shabti doll that had been placed in his tomb. Today, the papyrus of Ani resides in the British Museum, where it has been since 1888. Only Ani, if anyone, knows what really happened after his death. But thanks to his Book of the Dead, we can imagine him happily tending his crops for all eternity.
And so what's nice about the Book of the Dead is that they are actually customizable. So if you remember particular phrases and particular elements, you don't have to have those on it. That becomes important because only the wealthy can afford to have all the different phrases on it. There's a whole range of them because 95% eventually of the Egyptian population are going to own these. So some are like poor man's, very small, very tiny little issues. Some are giant, kind of 78 feet long. The longest one we found so far is 300 feet long with multicultural images and spectacular. Your soul after your death would live in one of these. These are called Ka statues. So your soul is called a Ka. And note here he's holding a metal rod, which shows he was given to, this is the Pharaoh and his wife. He was given this from the power to rule for all of eternity from the God. And over here is an Ankh, which actually is the female symbol of life. So he has the power to rule of all eternity forever, with his wife supporting as the Pharaohess. So this is Menkaure. This is the smallest of the three great pyramids right here. Note, it's very unusual, but he was buried with his wife, one of his wives, the wife that gave birth to his first son that he was madly in love with. So this Egyptian death in the afterlife then carries over from the fantasy coffins of Ghana, celebrating a life well lived, here for a fisherman, to the Mexican Day of the Dead that we see in Coco, the idea that you can visit your ancestors once a year. Japanese Oman Festival, also the Festival of the Ancestors, all based upon these three concepts. Again, at death, you become an ancestral spirit. Your ancestral spirit is 10 to 100 times more powerful, and your ancestral spirit acts as a go-between between your family and you and the gods. One of my favorite artworks in all of Africa is this one, and this largely is something we actually very briefly covered before. The name of this is called a Dwayne Filbara. They're ancestral screens. They translate as forehead of the dead, and they're only done by one particular family in all of the culture, the Pokia family by the Kalabari Ijal. So what makes these interesting is twofold. One, it's not just the individuals represented, but two, the Pokia family learned this making style from Europeans. So it's got mitered corners like we have in our picture frames. And later on, the Europeans are going to get a benefit after teaching this particular family to be able to do this, because this is going to be the model and what Picasso uses to create constructed sculpture, changing Western art forever. So an African art tradition is based upon a European tradition of their ancestors, which then impacts the European tradition of art all the way till today. So kind of a cool story that shows up. All three major societies have to be achieved in order for one of these to be made. And so there's there's 20 of them exactly that have ever been made. They have to be a master of the Equine Water Society. Here you can see them holding an herbal medicine member of that. And here, where they actually have a boat, because they set up a society that worked with the water on the boats and the trading network. They have to be members of the Perrier Warrior cult. Most of them in the right hand or the left hand holds a weapon. And you can see the heads often beneath the feet. Those are absolutely beheaded individuals. And these are often beheaded individuals up top too, depending upon how effective they were in war. And finally, a Wari trading house. They have to be exceptional traders. So here they're emphasizing how an exceptional trader he is, specifically because he actually created new trade networks right here with Europeans with these large scale boats. So the founder of a new lineage, the founder of a new Wari, a phenomenal dancer, a highest grade of the Equine Water Society, celebrating the water ancestors. They live in the marshland, so there's water everywhere, and a father of 10 children. You'll note we have these little things that are almost reflective mirrors. These are generally two of their sons, their eldest sons that are next to them. The open mouth with teeth, the aggressive coming out. They'll have something in their right hand and in their left hand kind of sticking out, all from hundreds of pieces of sculpture wood, and they're about 3.5 feet tall. So they're really very cool. Now, besides that, while making it, there's all sorts of chants and rituals that go along with it. And that's why even if you have the technical skill to be able to do this, only the Pokia family can really make this work. You will notice headdresses also on the other individuals, showing that their sons are high ranking. So this is an Otobo mask. I know it's hard to see, but you might be able to see that there's 2 teeth coming out of the bottom. This is actually a representation of a hippopotamus mask, very much so showing that even his sons become masters of the Equine Water Society. So they also hold, here they've been lost. You can see they also hold armaments or things that kind of symbolize what their father's been able to do. And they almost always wear trade cloth that they traded with Europeans. And so that's what we're looking at. You can see the size and the scale that shows up. They are about life size. They're about 5 feet tall. They're large. And you can see the variations that we have, all done by one family of carvers that show up. You see the relationship in the ancestral worship also then, even in Black Panther, which I got to work on. And so the whole idea is to be able to enter in as often and frequently as you can into that less visible world through ritual, at least once a year. And we'll talk about some of these similarities. So these are all fantasy coffins. These are coffins where a Ghanaian family wants to honor one of their ancestors that has recently died by having them buried in their favorite things with what represents their profession. So here we have someone who was a preacher that was buried in the Bible, a photographer buried in a camera, fisherman in a fish, cell phone salesman in a cell phone, a driver in a Mercedes, a mother hen, a very powerful woman actually who was very devoted to her children. So it can be a male and a female tradition, and of course a Coca-Cola salesman, bottle salesman. So these are fantasy coffins. They cost about $400, maybe $500 today. They talk about $400 to ship to the United States. So these are actually much cheaper than coffins that we would have here in the United States. And they are legal for burial anywhere that we want here. So for example, I could be buried maybe in a laptop computer or maybe in a map of the shape of Africa. And it would cost less than a traditional coffin if I wanted to be buried in this kind of concept here in the Western world. Men and women. And so these basically get danced all throughout the town and all throughout where you are. And they go from place to place as if your spirit is guiding them. So the funerals might take hours because it might stop at the bar for a local drink. It might go to your elementary school. Most people lived in smaller environments, didn't move away that much. It might stop where you met your wife or where you met your husband as it being danced around. So here's a really good depiction of this, which is going to be the basis of New Orleans jazz festivals.
In an outlying district of Ghana's capital city, Accra, Anan Sidi makes a remarkable product. He is a coffin maker. And in this part of Ghana, coffins are something special. This chili pepper coffin was built for a restaurant owner. This passenger plane for an international businessman. The lion commemorates a powerful tribal chief, the rooster, a humble farmer. Each coffin celebrates the life of a loved one.
I think I need more from.
Customers sometimes ask for something new, and then it can't be rushed. I have to really think about the design.
The people here believe a funeral is the culmination of a person's entire life, and that it's preferable to incur lifelong debts than to cut back on funeral expenses. These fantasy coffins have been exhibited in art galleries throughout the world.
Is the biggest transition that they have in life.
They are only created by a handful
So this is
of
basically the
artists,
equivalent of like
all
our
based
college
in a single
education.
district. His father, Kane Kwe, pioneered fantasy coffins in the 1950s and passed the business on to his son. Anand's workshop will turn out around 100 fantasy coffins a year. Prices begin at about $400. A considerable expense for the meager earnings of most Ghanaians. Today, Anand is delivering a special commission, an exclusive design for a powerful local woman. A banana-shaped coffin for a banana seller. The deceased is Madame Salwe Mele, better known as Gladys. She started life as a vegetable seller, but she found fame as a priestess. Ghana's priestesses are guardians of a religion which sprang from a landscape long since disappeared, a world of sacred groves and forests.
We'll talk about that during our magic and witchcraft versus science way of looking at the world in Africa.
Gladys's body is put on display to allow family and friends to publicly express their grief. It's also an opportunity to ask Gladys to pass on messages and complaints to the spirits of dead friends and relatives. Gladys's daughter-in-law tells her how much she will be missed. Going without food or water for the duration of the ceremony, the priestesses dance themselves into a trance, occasionally becoming possessed by spirits from another world.
Again, the less visible world coming to our visible world.
Led by Gladys's sons, the coffin makes its way toward her final resting place. A fitting tribute to a remarkable life.
And it will be danced then all throughout where they actually want to go to. And so it will end up at their favorite restaurants and wonderfully. Now, $400 is a considerable expense in Ghana, specifically because $400 is what an average family individual will make. So basically, you're paying an annual salary to cover your entire funerary costs. That's just for the coffin. Then you've got to feed and host the entire village, welcome that village, particularly for someone who's very important. And that itself can take 3 days. Hiring professional mourners, that might take more money as well. So entire family might spend on the funeral more than they expend on a year of college here in the United States of America, or in even what an entire family might make. Now, as we move a little farther from Ghana, we're going to move 2 countries, actually 3 countries east, to the Yoruba peoples in Nigeria. The Yoruba people are one of the great, probably the most prolific art producing individuals in all of Africa. And so we have 3 different art forms that deal with different aspects of death that I want to share with you, just to show you how common it is across the continent. So we're going to be looking what happens if a dead child, particularly that's a twin that dies. There's a tradition about that. If an ancestral dies, or if you want to honor specifically elderly women who are considered to have specific powers when they die. And so here's the 3 different things we can look at. The first one we're going to look at is the Yoruba Ogungun dance. Ogungun. It's a dance for each family's ancestors, and it can be performed periodically whenever you would like. You don't have to wait for a particular ceremony or a particular day. If you believe that your ancestors need to be honored as your ancestors, you're going to use them. The Yoruba magical number and their mystical number is 16. So the cloths that are worn by these Ogungun dancers, which is supposed to represent a monkey that we'll see in a bit, they can be reversed. And so while the dancer's going, they can actually call what's called performing miracles, and they can dance them over. And any male family member is able to dance these. Now, it's based upon an Ngugun founding myth that shows up here from the Yoruba culture. And here's the founding myth of a pothos monkey. Here's what they look like. Note there's 2 colors for the flipping part. A pothos monkey and a woman produced an offspring named Ogungun. That's where the name comes from. He asked if he could become a masquerader to cover up his monkey parts so that the Yoruba did not mock him, and they allowed him to do that. So generally when you look at the red, you can see from the monkey fur, that's the monkey fur color all the way around. So whenever you see that, that's the monkey parts that are actually showing. So the pothos monkey actually who lives in this, you can see more of the tropical regions, that shows up the tropical forests, engage in high-speed sequences. They spring off of trees. They're very acrobatic. They change abruptly in terms of direction. And that's exactly how they're going to dance the Ogungun masquerade. So generally, only the most athletic individuals can dance. So before I show you a dance, I'm going to give you the basic dance elements that you can see up here. So one move is I have an upright stance with arms extended straight up, pose, so you get the maximum height. Then you get the idea of twirling, so you see here with the upright, so you can get the idea of the greatest width. Sometimes it can be 12 to 14 feet across. They can fold the cloth over grace and skill of how you can be inside the cloth and still fold parts of it. You can turn the cloth inside out. That's what this artist is about to do, calling performing miracles. That illustrates the expert dancing technique of the masquerader and the changing colors appearance of the masquerade, because there's multiple, remember there's 16 different layers of cloth that are here, and step primarily forward very gracefully with a very high knee, showing how actually a monkey moves using its midsection like a pothos monkey in a tree, and then running off within the process. So that's what we're going to be looking for as we watch the masquerade. So these are the Gungun masqueraders coming in. You note the various levels of cloth. Note the tails often dragging behind like a monkey. Note the stepping forward like the pompous monkey there in a tree. Now this is a masquerade that was done at a cultural performance, and so lacks some of the religious value, because normally you'd have the entire family cheering the individual around, because this is your lineage ancestors you're honoring, your family itself. The drums behind are the Yoruba talking drums, so they can actually play, because Yoruba is a tonal language, they can actually play different instruments almost as if they're talking words out loud. Now, each individual believes that they are possessed by their spirit ancestors. So it's not an individual dancing anymore, even though it is an individual. It's the spirits themselves that are dancing. No, he's actually going through the process of turning the mask inside out. No, so now you get a different look. That's called performing miracles. Like the pompous monkey has two sides. And so now you're seeing both sides here. You count the cloth, so you'll note there's 16 different pieces of cloth. You really start to know what you're looking at. So that's called turning inside out. Now he's folding the cloth. No, it's a very different look each time you fold the cloth now. Jumping around like a monkey. And they continue up calling the ancestors out. And so that's traditionally what a thing would look like, what a masquerade would look like. Now, other versions, so outside of the Yoruba tradition, and we'll come back and we'll look at a couple of these different, there's these individuals here. These are actually from Central Africa. So this is a concept that's true all over Africa. And so these are the Fang peoples, and the Kota peoples, and the Mahongwe people. So note, 3 different styles. They're all anywhere from about 18 inches to 2 feet tall. And these represent protectors over the ancestors. They are ancestors themselves. So you'll note the head shape is roughly the same, the outline, but their abstraction of the details are radically different that show up. And that's because the Fang believe in an aggressive masculine. powerful, even though it's feminine. Here, as you can see the breast coming out. It could be masculine, but no, they're going to have large muscles. Sometimes they'll have aggressive open mouths like this as well. This is to protect the ancestral bones themselves. These people believe that after they bury the bodies after a few years, they exhume the body and they bring up the bones and put the bones in bone bags. And these are the protective spirits to ward off anyone who wants to harm the ancestors as they're kept in bone bags. So here we'll see a smart history conversation about the Fang one in particular.
We're here in the Brooklyn Museum looking
Gabon.
at
This is from Central Africa.
Sculpture, figure that performed an important role. It guarded a reliquary.
This figure is almost a talisman in that it was intended to ward off those that might harm the contents of that box, or as a warning to others who might come in contact with it and be harmed by it, like uninitiated men and women.
So the contents of the box that this figure guarded were sacred and powerful.
They were usually the bones of important members of society, important ancestors, along with potent substances like beads that they may have owned and medicine.
So who constituted a great man for the Fang people?
A very high status, noble person who had lived a long and good life. This would include lineage heads, clan heads, special warriors, even craftsmen who were exceptionally talented,
similar to the Dwayne Fubara
who had born lots
from the
of
Kalabari.
healthy children. It's believed that the Fang utilized these reliquary boxes with remains rather than putting them into a more permanent cemetery because they had been nomadic or semi-nomadic. They were probably maintained by elder men in the community who would be in charge of putting them together and consulting them when there was some great decision to be made.
The figure has an elongated torso, a large rounded head, eyes that look down, a closed mouth. The arms are clasped together, but there's a sense of very powerful musculature. So there's a balance between a figure that has a sense of calm and contemplativeness, and at the same time, real power and strength.
It's almost as though the figure has this coiled up energy, this vitality that's ready to spring forth if it was needed, but otherwise retains a very calm, dignified appearance.
The top of the head is enlarged.
For the Fang, we see an emphasis on the head, particularly the coiffure, and the tubular nature of the limbs and the body. There's also an emphasis on the herniated belly button, which is, of course, where the umbilical cord first gives life to humans, just as this reliquary is guarding the remains of the deceased who have returned back into the spiritual world, waiting for rebirth.
So this particular figure is a male figure, but the Fang also made reliquary guardian figures who were female.
These figures also had a second life as puppets during young men's initiations. In other words, they were brought out to educate young men about their ancestors and help young men experience or be in the same place as the essence or the energy of their ancestors, who really were the founding fathers, the lineage heads of their ethnic group. While the face is very typically stylized, the hairstyle was popular when this object was actually made. So we have these three crests and kind of a ducktail in the back, which is what Fang men at the time, high status men, were wearing.
When we look at so much African art, we're looking at art that is not naturalistic, and intentionally so. The purpose of the object was to express certain spiritual ideas. And so we see abstraction, we see eyes that are reduced to half circular shapes, and the cheeks forming these diagonal lines.
And this is what really inspired Picasso in modern art, for the abstraction in modern art.
Call abstraction. And we could also note that in the limbs, which are very cylindrical and rounded.
The artist could have very easily depicted a naturalistic looking figure, but they chose abstraction. This is a conceptual piece. It's about the idea of a reliquary, the idea of this guardian figure, rather than depicting an actual human or how they look in nature, which was not of interest to this Fang artist. The wonderful tension in this figure is the fact that he is suggesting one approach with honor and respect, with eyes closed and patience. At the same time, he's suggesting his strength to ward off
spirits or humans that may want to disrupt the contents of his box.
And so we have variations on that same idea of these protecting figures that show up between the Fang that we see here, the Kota. The Kota people is actually called the Mbulu Ngulu, so don't worry about it. But they call theirs Mbulu Ngulu, a protective spirit. And the Mahongwe actually call theirs a Wete. The Fang people call theirs a Biere. They're different languages, as I mentioned. There's 2,500 different cultural groups and languages, and these are very similar to one another. Now, as we look at the styles between the two, you'll note there are some distinguishing features. And these two groups basically are subgroups of one another. So they're groups that split off through marriage later on. The Kota peoples were the one that's called Umbula Ngula. This is the southern style. So they have a large concave or oval face, very small eyes. The nose is set in relief here. They have an elaborate crescent shape, specifically of Kota male headdress, as you can see up here, and a lozenge-shaped body parallel to the face for the legs and for the body. The Mahongwe, the Bwete figures, which is the northern style, concave, almost leaf-shaped that shows up, a projecting top knot right here that shows up, a lozenge-shaped body, but note, it's perpendicular to the faceplate here. So it's the same shape, just perpendicular. And so lines above the button eyes could represent scarification patterns that we see on the face and on the body of individuals. As we go through, you'll note that these protect the bones of revered ancestors, as you see here, from threatened from the community. And these are the individuals they're honored for a major ancestor, male ancestor, who killed an elephant, the first village to trade with a European, the large number of children, generally 8 or more, founding a lineage, and every few years the bones were removed from bags for veneration and replacement of the rotten bag from rats and other things to make sure that everything stays fresh, but also that their ancestors are all together in the realm, right? It's a bone bag, not just of one, but of multiple different ancestors that are of a family. And the Kota peoples, you'll see the same thing. They just happen to keep theirs inside of a spirit house that shows up. And that's true of both the Mbula Ngula, as well as of the Bwete, of the Kota and the Mahongwe.
We're in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, looking at an object that's known as a kota.
This is a Kota reliquary guardian. It would have served as an ornament to a basket holding the relics of the family.
Specifically, bones of a family member.
People in this region were slash and burn farmers. They would clear land for planting, and after 5 to 7 years, the land would no longer be fertile and the community would move to new farming lands. And for that reason, you didn't have access to your ancestors' graves. So it made sense to take some small part of beloved family members with you when you moved to a new place. Families who were using these reliquary baskets, like people using reliquaries around the world, felt that that tangible connection to an ancestor helped them connect to that ancestor in prayer across the divide of the living and the dead.
But this is not a representation of that person.
No, this isn't a portrait. It's an idealized representation of a male figure on one side and of a female on the other.
And that's very rare.
A recent estimate says that only 3% of the figures have 2 sides like this, and we're not entirely sure why some of these reliquary guardians have 2 sides.
Well, there's tremendous variety in these objects. The basic form is distinct. You have a large head, which is relatively flat, and this wonderful diamond-shaped body below it. Then there is just tremendous variety.
We are seeing more of the body of this reliquary guardian than its original audience would have, because the bottom part, this diamond-shaped lozenge, would have been sunk into a reliquary basket.
And so perhaps only the shoulders, that is the upper members of the diamond, would have been visible.
And that's why you see that the decoration stops fairly abruptly underneath these 2 rings.
I'm really taken by the decorative choices. The male side has a convex forehead, whereas the other side, the female, is concave.
And they have different applications of metal, different decoration as well.
On the male side, we're seeing large sheets of metal.
If you look closely, you can see the places where tiny little pieces of metal have been used almost like a staple to hold the metal sheeting onto the wooden support. There's a tiny, subtle one underneath the nose, and until you see that staple, you might not even realize that there are 2 sheets coming together there. This artist is very careful to keep a smooth surface because the shining, gleaming name of the metal was meant to mimic the shining gleam of water, which is thought of as the division between the living and the dead. The shining metal is hard to achieve when applying to a convex or concave curve. And so you can see that the artist has ensured it stays flat by carefully securing it to the wooden support.
And one of the things that I find most attractive about these objects is the way in which the inherent colors of each metal is used to define each form.
We know that artists working in this tradition thought about the different colors of the metal they were using. So you can see a red strip of copper over each eye as an eyebrow and also coming down the center of the forehead.
And then this yellow halo-like form around the head itself.
The new theory about this halo shape is that artists who were flattening and abstracting an image of the face turned the hairstyle sideways. It's unusual that our Kota reliquary guardian has white eyes and not black iron eyes. Ours were used from a bone from an animal, so creating a new color, a white color. Some other guardians have that color combination, but most have the yellow, red, and black color combination. When you look at the female side of the figure, we can see a different construction method. We believe that artists worked this either by cutting very thin strips or a hand-pulled wire from existing forms, which is a difficult process involving drawing the material through successively smaller holes, and then they hammered it flat. And if you look at the side of the figure, you can see that the artist has turned that metal and pushed it into the wood support to secure it.
One can imagine that this would afford a maximum use of material, which must have been important because metal was precious.
When you first encounter a reliquary guardian, it seems shining and perhaps even made of metal. But if you look closely, you can see that the artist has used this as a precious material and used the smallest amount to make a maximum impact. So it's a very thin sheet of metal on the top of a wooden support.
So here in the United States and in Europe, it's taken us a century to catch up with the original audience, to understand the sophistication and subtlety of these objects.
It's taken Europeans and Americans a long time to walk away from the legacy of colonial beliefs about African people and Kota reliquaries in particular. And now we can understand that they're part of a deeply thought religious faith and also absolutely stunning aesthetic objects that were never aiming at the same goals as European and American traditions.
And evidence of that kind of Western misunderstanding can be found even in the word Kota. We call these Kota objects, but in fact, they were not made by the Kota people. They were made in an area where the Kota people lived, but by peoples that surround them.
We're using the word Kota in our conversation today because if people want to learn more about these, all of the textbooks and the articles and books are about Kota reliquaries, even though we know in the scholarly community that that is a colonial misappropriation of a word.
But this is such a good reminder of the baggage that continues to cloud our understanding that comes from the colonial period.
When these were collected, it was just after people in Gabon had converted to Christianity en masse and rejected the reliquary guardians and the relic bundles underneath them as evidence of converting to their new faith. At that time, colonial officials, enterprising local people, and Christian missionaries collected the reliquary guardians and sold them in Europe. And because of that framework, when they presented them in Europe, they presented them as evidence of a savage or debased faith. It's important when we think about and look at African art and read earlier testimonies and books to remember the perspective of the people writing them, usually from a colonizer's perspective and not from an artist or patron's perspective.
All right. We also see some of these things showing up. So here's an interesting one. So in Kenya, if we move all the way to the East Coast, there's some pending bills that show up about the Miji Kenda, Bigongo. Bigongo are actually funerary posts that traditionally the Miji Kenda put up to honor their ancestors. So here's actually an African news story about dealing and how we deal with these posts in the modern day world.
An American museum based in Denver has returned artifacts belonging to the Mijikenda community. The wooden symbols, locally known as Vigango, represent dead family members and serve as a link between living relatives and their departed loved ones. The artifacts will be restored back to the community, where spiritual ceremony will be done. Given the time. An American museum based in Denver has returned artifacts belonging to the Mijikenda community. The wooden symbols, locally known as vigango, represent dead family members and serve as a link between living relatives and their departed loved ones. The artifacts will be restored back to the community where a spiritual ceremony will be done. Kevin Mutai joins us live from the Fort Jesus for the details. Kevin?
Well, thank you so much, Zainab. We are live from Fort Jesus in Mombasa, and here it's a milestone for the Mijikenda community after receiving these 30 pieces of vigango. It's a valuable cultural artifact for them, and they say that the move by the Denver Museum in the United States, that in the state of Colorado, to return these particular artifacts is another achievement for the community to reconnect back to their loved ones who departed a long time ago. We are told that this particular artifact represents a buko, that is a spiritual leader in the Mijikenda community. And indeed, we are also informed that these are 30 pieces and 29 others are lying at the international airport, that is Jomo Kenyatta, waiting to be brought back to the coast and delivered to the owners. Those are the Mijikenda people. Let me quickly engage one of the proprietors of this facility to just quickly take us through what value do these particular artifacts have in the Mijikenda community. Just tell me, what does this move mean for the Mijikenda people?
Well, this they mean quite a lot because they represent the central spirits of elders who are initiated into the Gogo society. And when you talk about Gogo, we're talking about the traditional leadership in terms of religion, in terms of the politics of the communities. There are people who are being consulted, but they have to be initiated into the Gogo society. So when they pass on, then that is a time when now they can be able to install a vigango in respect of those who have departed. So basically what we are seeing here is actually the spirits of those who departed and initiated the Gogo society as leaders, traditional leadership leaders, both politically and at the same time spiritually. Yes.
But is this particular culture being still practiced currently within the Mijikenda people?
Very much being practiced, and the people you are seeing behind me are actually representing the Gogo. They have been initiated, and they're the ones who actually make these things on behalf of the communities. Yes.
And now that they are in the hands of the National Museums of Kenya, are we looking forward to perhaps maybe you people in charge tracing back to having these particular artifacts go to the respective families that they were taken from?
Well, perhaps maybe not to the families per se, because we do not know which family they came from, but we are giving them back to the communities. So in that way, we feel that they are closer to where they are coming from, rather than in the United States of America.
And perhaps this urge for money.
So right there are some of the issues. If you are going to give back African art or stolen art from colonial period, who do you give it back to? Does it go back to the family, the community, the nation state? That's a challenge that we actually have to deal with from the very get-go. And also, how are these things protected? Remember, in the museum, in the Western world, it's very, very patriarchal to say it, that we treat objects differently or better than other objects. So I don't want to use the word better, but differently. These artworks would actually be left outside. So the fact that they're outside, not under humidity control, not under temperature control, they are wood, they will eventually rot over hundreds of years, where in the Western tradition, we would keep them forever. Now, they should still be able to use them in any way that they want. This is an African art form. They are meant to disintegrate over time. But that is one of the arguments that oftentimes people in the Western world, well, they'll be gone in 1,000 years and no one will know. Well, that is true, but it's also how they want to practice that particular artwork as well. And so there is some patriarchal kind of concerns that show up as we have these conversations. But some museums are starting to do the right thing and return them willingly, particularly when they're ancestral spirits. So we have totem poles from the Native American tradition. They have a better argument, at least legal argument, because we can say on some level we took their cultural heritage and they're American, so they have legal rights. Whereas these individuals, these were all taken before January 1st, 1920, therefore they really don't have a legal right. But the Denver Museum did the right thing here. We do have people dealing with multiple kind of different aspects of death in the modern day world. As I mentioned, genocide is still a very not common, but a thing that happens actually in Africa. And so this is on the Rwandan genocide, that people literally just be left to disintegrate, like we saw some of those early traditions. So this is by a Ghanaian artist talking about other African areas where this takes place. So this is by Kofi Setorji from 1994 to 1999. And 937,000 individuals were murdered in 100 days in a genocide in Rwanda. And I'll tell you, it's one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had. I arrived on the ground 10 days after the genocide ended. And unfortunately, this is what I found. They didn't bury a lot of the bodies. They allowed animals to come up, and the stench was absolutely putrid. So I actually have all sorts of issues and nightmares that still, because of these bodies and the way that they moved and flowed, and that's 930, a million people, basically, and many of them left in this kind of capacity. And finally, what's the impact that we have? Well, the impact of all these, particularly the